I do not have any AC units, unfortunately. I sold out of those within the first 2 days I brought them in this week.
I didn't think it would be this hot. I mean, I come here all the time, but today is just like really, the surface of the ground is super hot.
We just have the air sealing, the fans. Yeah, the fans. We have fans, and that's all. We just keep the windows open, and we try to have that cross air, you know, like makes it cool, everything. Yeah. That works really well, and it saves a lot of energy, yeah.
I think that we all should be doing our part to save as much energy, conserve as much as we can.
Yeah, it may be the first day of summer in the Northern Hemisphere, but for some 50 million people in the U.S., summer has arrived early and hotter than ever before. In just the last week, high temperature records have been shattered all across the western half of the United States. Let's pull in the map to show you what we're talking about. Salt Lake City in Utah just saw its hottest day since record keeping began back in 1870, 107 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 42 degrees Celsius. You see it right there. Wyoming also saw new records. In Nevada, Las Vegas continues to flirt with its all-time high of 47 degrees Celsius. You see right there. But the U.S. city melting the most, Phoenix, Arizona, which just set an all-time record of 5 consecutive days of 115 degrees Fahrenheit. You see it right there. That's 46 degrees Celsius. Now, the heat is making severe droughts across the western U.S. go from bad to worse. The federal government is already planning to declare an official water shortage at Lake Mead in August. Lake Mead's waters power Hoover Dam. Now, this picture, it tells the story, doesn't it? As of last week, Lake Mead's water level is at a record low, and there is no relief in sight. The western U.S. is in what scientists are describing now as a climate change-induced mega drought. Some even say that this summer could be the hottest and the driest in a millennium. And less water means more fire. 2020 saw a record number of wildfires in California, Oregon, and in Washington state. 2021 is expected to be worse. Stephen Pyne is a leading environmental scientist who has written extensively on fire and climate change. I want you to take a listen to how he describes what is happening.
I think what we're seeing with climate change is that it is acting on and exaggerating all kinds of climatic conditions. And so it is making things worse. We're seeing more frequent fires, more severe fires. We're seeing them at a scale, not just in terms of area, largeness, but intensity plus area combining. I've got children, I've got grandchildren. What kind of world are they going to inhabit? It's going to be a very different one. If the climate change trajectory isn't flattened, then all those will be overridden. I mean, all those temporizing things, all those small-scale things we do will simply be overwhelmed.
Well, my next guest has also been sounding the alarm on the increasing number of weather catastrophes compounded by climate change. Rachel Cletus is with the Union of Concerned Scientists. She joins me tonight from Arlington, Massachusetts. Rachel, it's good to have you on the program. Last year, you testified before a U.S. House committee, and you warned of heat waves, droughts, and wildfires becoming more extreme and more common. And that is exactly what is happening now before our very eyes, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's very, very sobering to see. Climate change is here and now. This is not about some distant future. We're seeing this terrible heat wave that you just described on your program unfolding around the western U.S. Right now. We're seeing conditions of extreme drought setting up for a terrible wildfire season that's already begun. It's already underway in the western U.S., and we're just now in June. So this is just the front end of summer. Very sobering.
Rachel, can you point to any real action or tangible measures of the U.S. government since you testified last year before that committee?
Yeah, so just to unpack it a little, we are here in this moment, this terrible drought and wildfire season, not because of any individual year. This is a multi-year trend that has been set up. Climate change is driving these very extreme high temperatures. We're seeing earlier snowpack melt. We're seeing the ground very, very dry in a multi-year fashion, and that's setting up a wildfire season of the kind we're describing. We have a lot of catch up to do, and that's just the bottom line. So this Biden administration, the new administration that's come in this year, as well as Congress, really has a lot of ground to make up. We have to be both investing in making sure that our forests are healthy, forest ecosystems are healthy, that we're investing, of course, in the emergency firefighting and the relief measures that communities need. But we have to be thinking about the long-term trend here. We're not going to be able to avoid all of these conditions. The fact is our current and past heat-trapping emissions have already created really dangerous conditions. So now the question is, how can we try to minimize the risk?
I know, as someone who studies the climate, you described the election of President Biden in November like waking up from a nightmare. He immediately rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. That is true. But other than that, the world has been focused on his infrastructure bill, racial equity, and just recently on the transatlantic alliances and U.S.-Russia relations. Have we overlooked important climate change measures?
Look, climate is connected to everything. It's connected to our economic well-being. It's connected to our future prosperity. It's connected to our infrastructure decisions, because what we're finding is when we fail to take climate risks into account, our infrastructure is starting to fail more and more. We're talking about wildfires, for example, and last year we saw the power grid in California fail repeatedly in the face of these wildfire risks. We were seeing utility companies take proactive measures to shut down power during high wildfire risk moments, and that left a lot of people with these rolling blackouts that have other cascading impacts. Or we saw the power grid itself trip wildfires. So we have to, any infrastructure we're investing in right now as part of this American Jobs Plan that President Biden has outlined needs to be both low carbon and climate resilient to prepare for the future that's really coming our way right now. You talked, for example, about the power grid and the connections with the low water supply, and we're seeing hydropower being reduced, the access to hydropower because of the low water levels in these reservoirs. All of these conditions are impacting our infrastructure, and therefore we need to be taking proactive measures to make them more climate resilient going forward.
And Rachel, let me ask you, how do you grade the way we, the media, are reporting on weather extremes and climate change?
Well, I think more and more we're seeing reporting that's connecting the dots between climate change and these extreme disasters, but probably not enough. And people are still looking at them as one-off disasters instead of the terrible trend that we've set up. We have a wildfire season right now that's getting underway, but we also here in the United States have an above-average hurricane season that's forecasted. We're going to see these kinds of risks collide, and government agencies like in the U.S., the Federal Emergency Management Agency, are going to be tasked with dealing with multiple disasters at the same time. We're also seeing communities being hit hard repeatedly. Communities that were hit by wildfires last year are still struggling to get back on their feet. Similarly, with hurricane-affected communities in the Gulf South and the coastal U.S. So this is where we have a situation where dealing with these as one-off disasters while they're in the headlines is just not enough. We have to take proactive resilience measures.
You know, we throw around these record high temperatures all the time, and we assume they mean something to our viewers. Scientists in Australia, they're referring more and more instead to what is known as the excess heat factor, which factors in how much impact and stress a heat wave has on people, for example. In your opinion, is that a better gauge to use to communicate what climate change is doing to our weather and doing to us?
Yes, we need some way to convey the truly exceptional conditions that we have when we have these multi-day events of extreme heat, because you don't get that cooling effect at night times. You get the human body being really stressed, especially people who are working outdoors, like right now, workers who are working in the fields in the Western U.S., construction workers, even children who are doing sports outdoors. When you have these multi-day heat events, there is no break, and it is truly catastrophic for the public health, for homeless, for the incarcerated population. And that's why we need a way of conveying to the public the true risks that they face, to be really careful, of course, to stay indoors and stay cool as far as possible. But also, some of these places are going to get really unhealthy for people to live in when we look out into the future. And that is when we recognize that we have to curtail the emissions that are fueling climate change.
Yeah.
There's a limit to what we can adapt to.
Do you still believe, Rachel, that we can save the world and the climate as we know it if we cut carbon emissions to zero no later than by 2050? Is it still possible?
Look, even at 1 degree Celsius global average temperature increase, which we're at right now, a little over that, we're seeing some really profound effects. But yes, we do still have a very consequential choice in terms of limiting how far and how bad these impacts get. We have to do everything in our power to limit those emissions. Otherwise, we will get really catastrophic conditions. So we can't avoid all the harms, but we can limit some of the worst harms, and we should.
And I have to ask you, while we've still got you here, a carbon tax on everything that we buy, services, everything that creates CO2 emissions. Would that be the most equitable way to get rid of CO2 emissions and to make sure that we're all invested in that?
A carbon tax is not a silver bullet solution. It can definitely be an important, powerful tool. But when we're thinking about equity and justice, we really have to be thinking about who's being hurt hardest and at the foremost from these impacts, and making sure that they're protected, that they have the investments in their communities.
All right, Rachel Cletus with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Rachel, it's good having you on the program. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Please come back and talk with us again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.